Hello all. It's good to see you. Let's begin with a short meditation. Okay. We've spoken before about the distinction in spiritual practice between inner practices versus outer practices. In essence, to be kind of oversimplified perhaps, we could say that spiritual practices can be divided into inner and outer, kind of those that are more meditative, introspective, contemplative, and those that are more pertain to those ways that we bring practice into our daily life or into activities. There's a variation on this distinction that's useful to explore also, which is a little bit more kind of elaborated, you might say. And it's the distinction between well, one terminology that's interesting that's used to describe this difference comes from the Buddhist tradition, especially, for instance, we find it in Tibetan Buddhism. And the term is the two accumulations. And what's meant by this distinction is a bit similar to just the notion of the difference between inner and outer practices. But at the same time, I'm going to talk about it in a way that's a little bit more involved than that. It's really closer to the distinction that I've been making, kind of the classic, the traditional distinction between mind and body. But as you'll remember from some previous talks, the way that I'm using the words mind and body are also in a kind of enhanced way. And by that I mean that it's closer to what might be better described as the difference between form and formless. Oftentimes people in spiritual contexts use the word formless to refer to spirit or to the transcendental, to something that is beyond, especially in more ascending style spirituality. Sort of start with being more identified with your body, and then the notion often is that you want to kind of peel away identifications, peel away veils, and move deeper. And eventually you come to more, you go into more emotional and psychological and intellectual realms, and eventually you come to more formless realms of pure spirit. My view is a little bit different than that. I acknowledge that there are those kinds of experiences, but I prefer not to designate spirit as something that's found primarily in another realm, or that you ascend in order to realize. And in fact, in my own experience, these higher realms, which are in a certain sense very spiritual, I prefer to talk about as realms of universal mind. And what I mean by that is that they're realms where transcendent ideas, what Plato called, forms, and he used, of course, the word form in a different way, but so we'll stick with that. He also referred to this realm as a realm of pure Platonic ideas. This is like idea with a capital I. So, for instance, the idea of duality, like we've been talking about Shiva and Shakti, that's a universal idea, like yin and yang, or like a principle like balance, or the middle path, or quality like virtues such as wisdom or contentment or patience or fortitude, or even numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, infinity. All of these are laws and principles and ideas that actually have a home in the universal mind, the formless, transcendent intelligence, consciousness, pure formless mind. Enlightenment itself is not merely gaining access to this realm. It actually has more to do with gaining wisdom about that dimension and its relationship to the form dimension, and ultimately about a reality that transcends all of those realms, even the realms of universal mind. So that's a slightly different point of view than a sort of standard ascending point of view about the planes. And so at the heart of this distinction, one of the important points, that the reason I'm bringing it up at this moment, is because the universal mind in the deeper sense is sort of a more essential definition of the true nature of mind. And what we ordinarily experience as the intellect is actually more part of the form dimension than it is part of the universal mind. The reason I say this is because most of our thought, ordinary human thought, is mediated by images and words. For instance, you notice when often we find ourselves, especially when we're alone, there might be some internal dialogue going on, and we're thinking about something, and that thinking is mediated with words. There's a kind of internal discussion that we're having with ourselves. Or we may even imagine that we're having it with somebody else, like if we just finished a conversation and we were unhappy with the way it went. We might replay the conversation in our minds, thinking that we're, sort of enacting as if we're talking to that person. But even on an intellectual level, so much of intellect is communicated in the world today, not only through words, spoken in the moment, voice, but also, of course, through written language. So there's a strong connection between the way mind is ordinarily used by humans and language. And also symbols, even words can be made into visual symbols to be put into print, but we have lots of other kinds of symbols that we use to communicate ideas, anything from, paintings and sculpture or visual communications to, street signs and all other all manner of different forms of, even just when we look at each other talking, as you're looking at me right now, you can not only get a sense of what I'm saying from the words that I'm using, but also from the way that I'm using my hands or the expressions on my face. There's a visual component. So in that sense, much of the ideas that humans ordinarily experience and share with each other are actually connected to form. You might say that in the same way we as souls incarnate into bodies, we incarnate our ideas into words and images, primarily, but other things as well, actually, too. So in that sense, our ideas are incarnate in a subtler type of form, which is language and images. So in that sense, the way we normally experience mind for most people is actually very mediated by and conditioned by form. So in this definition, body and form is not only our physical body, it's also our intellect and the emotional level as well, as many people are familiar with in several kinds of teachings that are around today. There's a notion that we have three main bodies. There are sometimes called our personality bodies or form bodies. And these are typically called something along the lines of physical, emotional, or astral and mental. And then beyond that level are formless dimensions. So from this point of view, what I'm suggesting is those first three levels as a whole are realms of form and embodiment, and subsequently they're bodies. Each of us have bodies. So we really have three bodies. So when we use a term like mind and body, I'm suggesting that an interesting way to expand our understanding more deeply into what that really means is we can look at all three of those dimensions, the first three dimensions of physical, astral, and mental as actually part of the form or body dimension, and that this thing we call mind with a capital M is in these more formless realms beyond that. And that there's a deep interconnection between them, and this sort of middle plane, the so-called intuitive plane, can be understood as a kind of marriage or an interrelationship between pure formless mind and the formal dimensions. So this phrase, the two accumulations from Buddhism, refers very much, I think, to these two basic realms of experience, mind and body, but especially to that dimension of mind that's behind our words and images. In other words, it's the dimension of mind that's, you could say in a sense that there's two aspects of mind. There's mind with form, mind expressed in form, and there's mind, formless mind, beyond form. So in the two accumulations, it's really making reference more to that intuitive and more formless dimension of mind beyond the form dimensions. So the reason I bring this up is because it can help us to organize our understanding of the spiritual path, both in terms of the different aspects of it, so that we have a sort of more complete understanding of the project of human spiritual development. But also because it gives a key to understanding stages as well. There's a question about the distinction between concepts and ideas. In one sense, they're the same. You know, we can choose if we want to make a distinction between some of these terms. Semantically, we could say, you know, understanding or wisdom or concepts or ideas or insights. You know, we could, if we want, we can break them down and say, well, let's mean something different. Underneath all of these is something essential, something to do with, you know, understanding, mind, intelligence. But normally I don't make much of a distinction semantically between ideas and concepts. But that gets into a little bit of a more advanced conversation, because if there is, let's say, if we begin at the level of the intellect on the so-called mental plane, and we begin to move beyond that, which is sort of mind with more form, then we move to the intuitive plane, which we start to go into a much more formless type of mind. And then there are three more planes or realities beyond that of even more universal mind. Then we can start to ask the question, well, what is in all these dimensions? Like if there's formless mind there, and it's made up of these different archetypes and ideas and universals, they're sometimes called, like love and harmony and oneness and polarity and balance and the laws like karma. All of these formless realms of universals, or that make up these realms, is there some kind of organization to that? Well, there is. It's something that I think, in fact, needs some mapping out. It's part of probably the emergent spiritual science and intuitive science of the future to have a more lucid understanding, because traditionally people have traveled to these realms, mystics have traveled to these realms for thousands of years, but not very, in my opinion, not very advanced clarification of the nature of these realms. Very, very often people just call them realms of bliss or formlessness or universality or spirit or wholeness or oneness, And that's true in certain ways, but there's actually a lot more content there. It's sort of like if you go outside at, in the middle of the night, you've come out of a bright room. And at first your eyes are, closed down because, your pupils are small because you've been inside. You can't, so you walk outside and you can't really see the stars. And at first it's just darkness mostly in the sky. And then your eyes get adjusted and you start to see, look at the skies filled with all this detail. Similarly, in these higher realms, when you first visit them, it seems like there's not much there. There's a lot of light, there's a lot of peace and stillness, and expansiveness, and some other qualities like that. You might feel very whole. But actually, there's a lot more detail there than that. There's no forms, so you're not going to find images. You won't find language taking place there. You won't see landscapes or planets or galaxies or any of these kinds of things. But that doesn't mean there isn't something there. It's not things as we normally understand that. It's these universals. And you can, in a sense, in the same way that if you live in a particular town or city, you can say, well, over there is, the center of town, and I can go there and experience the center of town. In these dimensions, since there's no space as we understand it, you don't travel to experience things, but you attune your consciousness to different things. So in these dimensions, you can change your attunement and attune to or even become one with any archetypal idea that you want to, like universal love or harmony, or you can merge into the experience of karma. You can also learn to bridge those realities back into the physical world so that not only are you still attuned to, say, universal love, but you're experiencing it integrated into your life. You see love everywhere. You see the attraction between molecules that bond together and form, complex molecules, or the attraction between atoms, or the attraction between planets that we call gravity. All of these are forms of love. We see love between humans and between animals and humans and between plants and the sun. Everywhere we look, we see love because we've immersed ourselves in this universal understanding of love. And if we can bring that back into this dimension, then we have a capacity to realize the meaning of love through doing that. The thing is, just going to that dimension, these higher realms, and immersing ourselves in these qualities is very inspiring. It's very, feels very liberating in the moment. But it's important to understand that simply doing that alone doesn't lead to truly understanding what those ideas are. In the same way you can be introduced to an idea, say you hear some scholar or scientist talking about an advanced idea like punctuated equilibrium and evolutionary theory. Just hearing those words doesn't make you understand what that means. Similarly, contacting these realities in those higher realms doesn't suddenly make you a master of these qualities or principles or wisdoms. You have to actually connect to those realities and then experience the distinction between those and their opposites, such as love versus hatred, and then live the reality of feeling the experience of what it means to know both of these realities. And then your understanding of what these universal archetypes actually mean grows. So it's not just about going to those realms and immersing yourself in them. That can be a part of your education. But it's actually not necessary to go there at all, because those universal ideas and principles and archetypes and laws permeate this entire realm, and we can contact them here without going out of our bodies and going into deep meditative states. Meditation, of course, helps, but it doesn't have to be a type of meditation that's about going to those realms. In fact, ultimately, it's more useful to contemplate the nature of those realities, the formless dimensions of universal mind, while in incarnation and in relationship to our ordinary experience. That's where wisdom will arise. So that's a little bit of a tangent. It's one that's kind of important. So I'll be sort of finding ways to sneak discussion of this into different contexts, because it might not seem quite as apparent yet, but as we kind of continue to work with this idea, it'll become more and more meaningful. Not only become part of one's experience, but the implications of understanding reality that way become increasingly evident. And so it might sound a little abstract and kind of difficult to relate to at this point for some people, but it'll grow on you. It'll start to come more alive. And as it does, it's very clarifying and illuminating to understand these distinctions. But we brought it up because there was a question about concept versus ideas. And one way to make a distinction between those two is the word idea, the way Plato used it, for instance, and Plotinus and other kind of, and it's also used this way sometimes even in Eastern traditions. Like I noticed that Sri Yukteswar, Yogananda's guru, talked about the same idea in the context of describing these higher worlds and where these ideas are. When it's capitalized, when idea is capitalized in this Platonic sense, it tends to refer more to something that's very universal and that would exist in its sort of purest form, you might say, its essence form. It would have its sort of home base, if you will, in these higher formless dimensions. Whereas a concept, to me, feels a little bit more like it's still more universal than the physical world. So that, for instance, if I have a concept of, say, something to do with economics, like the concept of unemployment, that's a concept. But it's not a cosmic universal that exists in the higher dimensions. It's more of a human universal that exists more like on the mental plane. Could even be sort of on the higher mental plane, but it's still not a very transcendent idea. Now you could go into any concept and tease out within it, hidden within it, are even more universal ideas. So within the concept of unemployment, there are more universal ideas that have more universal application, more universal implication. Excuse me, but not the way we normally understand a word like unemployment. That concept is a little bit more concrete, and so we'd find it. You see, that's the interesting thing to try to fully understand here, is these ideas. We're used to the idea that ideas are kind of come from the human intellect, and they're sort of made up. We kind of go around the world and we notice things, and then we make up ideas to kind of symbolize these things or these understandings that we, if we experience a cow, then we make up a word cow, and we develop some ideas about what a cow is, and some of these things are kind of relate to what's out there, and some of them are like unemployment, in a sense, is an entirely human invention, in the sense that you have to be human and you have to create an economy, and there has to be the possibility. So without humans, say, on this planet, the idea of unemployment wouldn't exist. At least we would imagine that's the case. So that kind of gives humans a sense that ideas are sort of random and we kind of make them up as we go. And there's a certain truth to that. But at deep levels of universal mind, a concept or an idea or a universal like love or harmony or oneness or duality or balance or karma, these laws and principles and ideas are cosmic and universal and eternal archetypes. They've existed since the beginning of time, and they'll always be. And they actualize all the time in all contexts and situations in some form or another. Love is in some form or another manifested in every story, every moment, every action, every relationship throughout eternity on all levels. So that type of an idea is not just a product of the human mind and capricious and relative, and it's much more universal than that. And so that's another way that I would maybe use the difference between a concept and a Platonic idea. A concept is kind of a type of idea, but it's more relative, it's more concrete. In a sense, you could say it literally exists, but it exists on a more concrete level. The mental plane is, the location of an idea like that, a concept. So when talking about this concept of the two universals, or the two accumulations, what do the Buddhists mean by this term? Well, the use of the word accumulation here means something that you're developing in your spiritual practice. And so the Buddhists are suggesting there's two basic kinds of something that's accumulated as we develop spiritually. And the difference between them is essentially related to this distinction of form versus mind and body. So on the body level, the accumulation there is basically could be tied much more closely to the concept of karma, because bodies act. And remember that the word karma in Sanskrit is the root term that the word karma comes from, it means action. So it's sort of like karma yoga, for instance, is action yoga, a spiritual practice that's cultivated in the context of action. So you could say that the two accumulations are kind of basically karma yoga, or that type of activity that pertains more to developing our spirituality in a way that is more connected to activities and form and bodies. And the other kind is, the other accumulation is the accumulation of wisdom. Intuitive wisdom, we'll call it, but actually it's broader than that, but we'll just say intuitive wisdom for now because it's adequately formless. So the reason this distinction is made is because there's an aspect of our experience in spiritual development where we gain a deepening of our fundamental sense of reality. So for instance, as we sit here together, we each are experiencing, whether we're noticing that in the moment or not, we're each experiencing a basic sense of reality. A normal human quality of experience, a fundamental aspect of ordinary human experience includes a sense of, to what degree do we feel separate, for instance, or connected to another person? Now, if we engage in some activity, let's say having a conversation with them, that's an action that can foster a sense of connection. But aside from that particular activity, what's our basic direct experience if we just are sitting there, listening to a friend talk, for instance? How spiritually connected do we feel to that person, or separate do we feel? That's one of the basic dimensions of what we mean by this experience of wisdom, or the accumulation of between, in the context of these two accumulations. This is what the wisdom aspect is referring to. Is this the pure? If you look out at the world, for instance, and you look at a landscape, what is your basic state of consciousness in terms of, like, how do you experience that? Do you project your own psychological state? Do you feel a sense of alienation? Do you feel a state where you know that it would be nice to commune more with nature, and you wish that you could, but you don't feel that way today? Because, well, in essence, this is sort of like, it's closer to the core reality of, in this moment, what state of consciousness am I in? Not what am I doing, what am I thinking, what kind of emotions are around. beyond that, what's the basic state of consciousness that I'm in? That's something that can change. That's something that becomes increasingly enlightened, awakened, as we grow spiritually. And for lack of a better word, we call the essence of that wisdom or enlightenment. So that's one half. And the other half is, as we become more enlightened, as we grow spiritually on the path, the content of our minds, our emotional body, and our physical body, and the kinds of things that we tend to do, changes. That, in a sense, you could say the karma of those three levels evolves and becomes more advanced, becomes more refined. Let's take the physical level as an example. As we function in the physical world, we all engage in activities all the time. And this generates karma. This generates an energy that becomes part of our nature ultimately. It's an energy that's projected out into the world, but it's also an energy that comes back to us. And it's based in large part on our motivation. So if our motivation is, say, aggressive and hurtful, then one kind of vibration goes out through our bodies, through our actions, and also as an energy into the world. And that's a negative karma, because aggressive energy is out of harmony. And so the natural feedback that we'll experience from the universe, the natural felt experience of acting in an aggressive way, for instance, is that it'll feel painful. We might not be aware of the pain in the moment, but it will come to fruition eventually. In fact, if we're adequately awake in the moment, we'll feel the pain immediately. It's inherent in the state. It's not a reward. Karma is not a reward and punishment system where a bunch of beings got together and worked out some rules, and then they go about punishing or rewarding people for whether or not they abide by these rules. It has more to do with the very natural sensation of what it feels like to act, not only physically, but on the mental and emotional planes, because those are levels of action as well. How does it feel to think a certain way, to create a thought? Like if we engage in a certain pattern of thought, like somebody's wronged us earlier in the day, and later we're thinking a lot of judgmental and angry thoughts at them. Those thoughts have karmic implications. They actually go out as energies. They affect that person, but they also bounce back, and we experience the basic sensation of what it means to be engaged in a kind of negativity like that, that's out of harmony with our true nature. So in a sense, you could say that the two accumulations spiritually are the core process of developing wisdom on the one hand, and the form level process of refining our karma, applying that wisdom to our three bodies, our mental, emotional, and physical bodies, and gradually improving the karma that we have in those bodies. And these two levels are very closely related. They're, for instance, if we have a lot of karma from the past in our personality, it becomes more difficult to develop wisdom, because that karma forms a kind of obstruction in our personality. And so then it becomes more difficult to be more conscious on a day-to-day level. And therefore, it becomes more difficult to deepen our intuitive understanding of the nature of life. So our wisdom is obstructed. The development of our wisdom is obstructed. So one way that people have developed spiritual practices, some practices emphasize more clearing out the karma on the personality level, so that you're essentially removing the obstructions, and then wisdom can develop more quickly because it's less obstructed by the personality's karma. Also, there's a part of our nature that we often called the soul or inner self. And that part's been accumulating wisdom for thousands of years through many incarnations. But if our karma in our personalities is a little too heavy, so to speak, it will obstruct the experience of expressing that wisdom that's in our inner being through our personalities. So again, the point of view of purifying the karma that's in the personality becomes a key part of releasing that inner wisdom that we've already developed and allowing it to be experienced and expressed in our personalities. So these are just a couple of examples. We'll talk at greater length about the nature of these two kinds of spiritual practice, two essential kinds, the karmic approach and the wisdom approach, and talk about the way they interact with each other and the strengths and weaknesses of each approach, and how they're best really put together as a more balanced approach to spirituality. But I think what I'll do at this point is just take a break for 5 or 10 minutes from talking and see if there's any questions about what I've shared so far. I will turn on the microphones too for the moment, just to see if there's any questions, and then after that we can do a meditation. So karma does not seem to be very efficient. It hit people.
Could I elaborate a little bit about it? It's like karma, people don't know anything about karma, and it hits them, and you don't learn from it before you know something about spirituality. In my mind, so way to people.
Yes, I understand what you mean. Yeah, this actually kind of gets to a pretty esoteric idea. But I'll talk about it briefly. Yeah, one aspect of the importance or meaning of karma is that it's one way to experience it is that karma is sort of a feedback system where we make actions and then we experience karmic fruits from that action. If we're able to connect the two, we can learn from that experience. And I think that what Rita is commenting on is how that's somewhat inefficient, because we often don't know what the cause of our karma is. We may experience, say, for instance, a state of mind or a physical condition, and how can we learn from whatever we're experiencing if it's caused by karma if we don't know why? This is well, I'll pause for a moment, but is that part of what you're getting at there?
Yes, and then again, there might be another way that it could be sort of, maybe it is very efficient if you take it from incarnation to incarnation. Like, let's say someone had been in the German,
right,
back in the Second World War, and the next life you might be crippled and in a nursing home and can't do anything, or someone is mean to you. You might learn from that, but that's in a longer perspective, much longer.
Yes. Well, this is, it's a big question. Generally, in a sense, you could say that one way to define what we mean by the higher self or the soul is that's the part of you that is always learning from your karma. So even if the personality doesn't understand where the karma came from, the soul does. And so the soul is always learning from whatever karma a person's experiencing at any given time. Now, you could say, well, what good does that do the personality? Well, directly, in the moment, it doesn't necessarily do the personality a lot of good. But what happens is that over many lifetimes, as the soul is learning from the karma that's happening, that means the wisdom of the higher self is growing. And as that wisdom grows, it's kind of, we'll think of it kind of as like an energy field. It gradually permeates the personality and infuses the personality with more and more of that wisdom. So in any given moment, in the ordinary life of a person, they might not be aware of specific karma, especially if it came from previous lives that they may be going through. But since the soul is growing from that. And eventually the implications of that growth will kind of filter down, not necessarily in the sense that the personality will understand all the experiences that that soul has been through that has led to the accumulation of all the wisdom that's developed over many lives. So in a certain sense, karma doesn't often or doesn't always show up as a conscious understanding in the incarnate self, the personality's understanding of where all this wisdom came from. But that doesn't mean that the wisdom isn't developing. Another system that's been put in place, though, to sort of try to help the personality to participate in that is the life review that happens after you leave incarnation. So as much as possible, what the spiritual systems that support the human kingdom, the hierarchies of lives, archangels and masters and other types of intelligences, what they try to do as much as possible when people leave incarnation is provide a situation where you can review the incarnation and look over all of the actions that you've engaged in and look at the karmic implications of what those actions were. So that then the person, in a sense, this happens ideally when the person is in an intermediate state in between having been in physical incarnation and having been reassimilated back into their soul. And at this point, they're still on the astral plane particularly. So the reactions that the person has to learning form new energies, new wisdoms that are in fact integrated into the personality, because the personality is not only made up of the physical body, but also the astral and mental bodies. So if, while you're still in your mental and astral bodies, you can review your life and learn from it and review the karma and see the consequences and gain wisdom from that, that creates energy patterns in the personality that become already part of it. So that's another step in that direction. But part of what we actually try to do in our spiritual practice, even on a day-to-day level, is increase the likelihood that we'll learn from karma. And of course, the basic teaching, the most essential way to do that is to expand awareness. The more we're aware, the more we're present in our day-to-day lives, the more we're willing to just be with the fullness of our experience and not push away suffering and only look for happiness. A lot of our behavior is geared around trying to basically distance ourselves from suffering. You know, we use everything from drugs to entertainment to becoming workaholics or other methods, coping methods, to sort of distance ourselves from the suffering that's in our lives. But as we embrace a spiritual path, one of the basic principles we want to cultivate is a willingness to just kind of be with the fullness of our lives, to feel fully what we're experiencing moment to moment, and to not seek refuge or escape in, addictions to entertainment or to, it's not that these different kinds of activities, like enjoying some entertainment or going for a hike or you know, the other things that humans do to seek pleasure and enjoyment in life are necessarily problematic, but we want to kind of wean ourselves from using them excessively to avoid our suffering, because if we do that, we diminish how much we can learn from our karma. We have to develop a certain amount of equanimity and acceptance and even courage to just be with life conditions and have a more spiritual attitude towards them, where we open to the sense that very often these painful conditions, as well as positive ones, are the fruits of our own karma. And in that context, we're more likely to gain wisdom about why, especially if it's something that's happened in this life. You know, for instance, a common spiritual practice is to end the day by reviewing the day and looking at, pick some things that happened and look at how did I act then? What was my motivation? How did it feel? We want to do this in a non-judgment. Karma isn't about being judgmental towards ourselves. It's just about looking at the truth. If we act with certain kinds of motivations, there's naturally going to be certain kinds of consequences. For instance, if we act out of greed or anger, jealousy, there's not only a quality of how that feels in the moment to act that way. That's, if we really look closely at it, it's not a very enjoyable state of consciousness. But also, it leads to consequences that invariably are painful for us and for other people. So if we are willing to just be courageous about facing our lives and looking at how we are, that'll speed up our growth, because we're learning from karma much more readily instead of trying to ignore the consequences of our actions, hide from them. I'm not sure. There's a comment about how well karma is accepted in the world. In general, yes, I would just say that karma is not in a sense, in the same way that we would say that spirituality is not pervasive in our current humanity. So certainly a more enlightened understanding of karma is not widely accepted. On the other hand, just in terms of trends, I would observe that in the United States, for instance, I noticed that more and more often people just in casual conversation even will just use terms like karma and talk about, and often not just as a joke. It used to be maybe 30 years ago you'd see it used in a more dismissive way or kind of a sarcastic way. But now people are just sort of integrating it in. I see a lot of younger people in their, say, 20s, for instance, will just regularly use the word karma. Oh, it's a couple was interacting and things went south, and then someone will just say something, look at how that karma worked out. So in the United States, I think even polls have shown that belief in things like reincarnation and karma have risen to the point where about 25% of the population embrace these ideas now. At least that's how they describe it themselves. So it may not be widely embraced, but it's certainly growing. Well, in a sense, 25% I think is getting to be somewhat widely embraced, and it seems to just be continuing to grow, the acceptance of these ideas. But karma is a very profound idea too. It's very, very rich, very multidimensional. The Buddha once apparently made the comment that only a Buddha can fully fathom the depths and richness of the workings of karma. It's a profoundly mysterious, multifaceted thing. So I don't mean to say that in the sense that to discourage people from seeking to understand karma, but to at least to keep an open mind at the same time, that we tend to have ideas about the way it works. But part of what wisdom means, in fact, we've been talking about this notion of the two accumulations, and one is the development of essential wisdom, and the other is the transformation of karma. But behind it, the foundation of that second aspect of our spiritual development, in part, is informed by how well, how much do we actually understand karma? Do we appreciate the degree to which karma is operating in our lives? Is our first thought, for instance, when we get a cold, oh, I wonder what physical conditions caused this cold? The materialist interpretation of disease is that it's always caused by some kind of physical condition, like, oh, I must have been exposed to a virus or whatever. And it's not as though these things aren't true. Viruses are real and they do play a role in disease, but they don't explain why two people would be exposed to the same virus and one person gets sick and the other doesn't. This is something that I think, is usually just written off to, oh, their immune system was stronger, so they were able to throw that off. But why was their immune system stronger? Well, ultimately, one of the factors I think that contributes to whether their immune system was stronger or not is karma. The constant creation of negative karma creates a kind of heaviness in our bodies, and especially in our etheric body, our energy body. And this etheric energy is key to being healthy. And when it becomes diminished by difficult karma, that also makes us more vulnerable to disease. So integrating this type of understanding, I don't mean necessarily just adopting it because some teaching says so, the Buddha said this, or such and such a spiritual tradition has this teaching about karma. All of these, I think, are powerful and interesting sources of inspiration, but ultimately our own practical understanding of karma will come from our own experience of karma, our ability to develop a type of intuitive awareness that is present enough moment to moment that we start to see the workings of karma directly in our own experience. There's in the Vipassana teachings, as taught in certain schools like Mahasi Sayadaw and taught in this tradition, the notion is that if you cultivate a simple awareness, an observational mindfulness, where you just be present to your experience in a calm and contented and kind of investigative way, where you're noticing what's happening moment to moment. As you get more concentrated and less caught up in the mind and the senses and less distracted, a more intuitive quality of awareness will arise, just naturally, and that certain intuitive insights, wisdoms you might call them, start to arise. And one of the teachings in the Vipassana tradition is that there's a series of 16 classical intuitions that arise more or less in a sequence that develop on each other. Don't worry, we're not going to go into all the details right now about what those are, but it's interesting to observe that the first insight, the first intuition that is identified in this sequence is insight, direct, immediate insight into the reality of the distinction between mind and body. One notices that there are states of sensory experience, for instance, and movements in the body, and one notices that there are moments of understanding, of comprehension, or of experience in terms of like, okay, I'm experiencing an itch, and then there's a parallel recognition in the mind. Oh, itching is happening, mind and body. So that's the first insight, getting clear, much more vividly clear that there is this distinction between mind and body. Then the second insight is noticing that there's a sort of feedback loop between mind and body that's karmically determined. So the next insight is the insight into karma. And it's not karma necessarily only in the long-term sense of like, this action now might lead to fruits that don't fully come to fruition for weeks or months or years, even lifetimes. It's a more immediate appreciation of karma as it plays out in the moment. Say For instance, let's say you experience noticing that an itch happens. In this more calm, intuitive state of awareness, it becomes much more obvious that immediately following the experience of an itch in the body, an impulse arises in the mind. The mind notices the itch and then wants to do something about it. So karmically, the awareness in the body of the itch caused the mind to notice it and want to do something about it. Then that intention to do something about it causes the body to move and scratch the itch. So there's this feedback loop bouncing back and forth between mind and body, and that's part of how karma works. And that's a kind of immediate and more easily accessible intuition that one can develop in spiritual practice, where you just see this happening. You see karma going on directly in your immediate experience. So when one is ignorant, then karma works slowly. When one is spiritually aware, karma can work very, very fast. Is that your experience also? Very much. In fact, we could say that, well, there's actually, a variety of parts, I think, to that point. But one of them is through developing spiritually, both our awareness of the nature of karma and how it works and how it plays out in our lives and in the lives of those around us deepens. But part of the effect of that too is that we learn much more quickly from our karma, and that speeds up our spiritual growth. But also past karma that's been generated gets worked off much more quickly when we're more spiritually aware. So we don't necessarily need to have much insight or even awareness. We can, even philosophically, we could deny the reality of karma, and we'd still work through it. If we do let's say if we just did a spiritual practice like saying a mantra, and we said this mantra with awareness and calm and concentration, and we said it for half an hour a day, and we did it every day. This saying that mantra will build up positive karma. It'll stimulate our spiritual energy and awareness, and it will create conditions where our karma gets worked off more quickly. And we don't have to even be aware that all of that's happening. We don't even have to be aware that karma is true on a relative level for that to happen. So that's an example too of how karma gets worked off much more quickly through the growth of awareness, whether we even understand karma or not. That's a great question too. Let me check in about time. I guess we have a few more minutes. The question is, why do some karmas ripen more quickly and others take longer? One of the mechanisms that comes into play with regard to how quickly a karma might come to fruition is whether the conditions are right or not. It's like, say, growing a seed. If the natural tendency of a seed from a plant is to grow into another plant, and that's its sort of karmic tendency, you might say. But if it isn't planted in the dirt, and it doesn't get any warmth, and it doesn't get any water, it can't come to fruition. So this means that karma, in order to come to fruition, not only needs to be there in the first place, but proper conditions need to be happening in order for that karma to come to fruition. I knew a fellow briefly when I was in college back in Massachusetts back in the around 1970, late 70s. And he told me about how he eventually he eventually gave up doing tarot readings because he found that he became very good at it, and that one of the things that he would often see is the karma of the person. Sometimes he would even see very sad and tragic karmas, like the death of the person or getting a bad disease or things like that. And he didn't like being in the position of knowing these things at all, much less feeling, having to decide whether to tell a person or not. So he just gave up doing the readings eventually. But he said in one instance, he saw, for instance, that someone was going to get in a car accident. And so he told them that this is what he saw, because his policy, he decided, was he was going to tell the person up front that he was just going to tell them what he saw, so that if they're coming for a reading, they have to be willing to just hear whatever's going to be revealed in the cards. So he saw that this person was going to have a car accident, so that person refused to get in a car. In a sense, you could say, in the context of our conversation, they refused to provide the conditions that would be necessary for that karma to come to fruition. So for weeks and weeks, they refused to get in the car, and of course, they avoided a car accident. Finally, they decided the whole thing was silly, and they got in the car and immediately had a car accident. Now you could say, well, maybe this was just, self-fulfilling. But it may very well be an interesting instance of this karma was ripe, but the person was able to avoid it by refusing to allow the conditions necessary for it to come about. But as soon as they were willing to, it did. In fact, this is one of the skillful methods that can be used to work off karma more efficiently and less concretely, because there are techniques that we can do where we essentially avoid circumstances that could allow karma to concretize in our lives more concretely, like getting an illness or being injured in some way. For instance, if you have the karma to be injured, but you're much more careful, if you're very mindful, that the karma still needs to be worked out, but there's a phenomena that we can talk about that has to do with that karma can be worked off in a subtler way. In other words, if you sit through a meditation and the karma comes up where you're going to stub your toe that day, but you've been very mindful and you are careful not to stub your toe, well, that karma still needs to be worked off. Instead, though, you might be sitting in a meditation and feel a sharp pain in your toe. You didn't do anything, but you allowed that karma to enter your body because you were mindful and relaxed and accepting, and then that karma comes to the surface. But because of your awareness, it'll be worked off more quickly, and it'll be worked off on a subtler level. In other words, instead of concretely as the actual experience of hurting your toe, you'll feel some energy in your toe, and it'll be painful, but it'll tend to be less, and it'll tend to pass more quickly. So part of what happens in spiritual practice is, through working with spiritual energy and consciousness, we create conditions that allow karma to be worked off more quickly, and often a lot of the karma can be contained in subtler levels and worked off in those levels of our experience, rather than if it's the kind of karma that was originally something that would naturally come out in our physical lives. Some of that karma can be contained and not worked out. Or if it does spill out into our lives, it can be changed and modified in a way where it's not as acute as it would have been. So this is all part of the art and science of working with the accumulation, as it's called in Buddhism, of the karmic side, the accumulations of karma. We want to build up positive karma and be skillful in the ways of working off the karma that we already have. Another reason that karma can be either worked off sooner, can come to fruition more quickly, or be delayed, is if we avoid it. Let's say, for instance, it's more of an emotional karma, and something happens, painful karma gets set in motion in the form of difficult emotions, but we're not willing to feel those emotions, so we repress them, then that karma is still active and isn't being worked off. And it's not until that karma either grows in such a way as that it's kind of is forced back into our lives in through some process, or we are willing in our state of mind to accept that karma back in. So for instance, a key part of spiritual practice for me, in my understanding, is to be present to our human personality and its three karmic dimensions of mind, emotion, and physical body, and be willing to just feel and experience whatever is arising there. At times we might want to engage in a practice like visualization or affirmations or working with mantras or a variety of other things that can be used to build up positivity in those bodies, positive karma, you might say. But we also have to create conditions that allow for karma to be released as well. And sometimes that's most easily facilitated by just being very aware and present to our personality and accepting and allowing whatever needs to kind of pass through to be purified to arise. And something we'll talk about at greater length is how to balance these two approaches, a more receptive allowing that facilitates healing and transformation of karma, and the corresponding process of, or complementary process of building up positive karma, both of which can facilitate working out older karma as well. So some of our karma we either haven't been willing to feel and experience and work through, or it's been decided by the lords of karma that we're simply not ready yet. It would be detrimental to our overall spiritual development to face that karma just yet. So it's set aside in a kind of latent state. It's just put to rest over, like in kind of in a storehouse, you might say. And then it's chosen what incarnation would be an optimal time to release that karma back into a person's experience again, so they can work it off and hopefully learn from it as well. So that's something that we'll come back to too. There's some more about the way karma is worked with that can be useful to understand in that way. Looks like this would be a good time. Well, let me see quickly if there's any follow-up questions to what we've talked about so far. Oh, I have a snore there. Why don't we?
You can shoot one person at a time on your end.
Do you know who it is?
I think it's that phone number, it seems.
Okay. I'm not on the right page, I don't think. That seems to have worked, huh? Okay. So any other questions before we take a break? Oh, apparently not. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and take a break, 10 minutes then, and we'll see you then.
Yeah, sure.
Se vie sen äänen kokonaan pois.
Okay, it looks like you're mostly back. To move in the direction of doing a meditation, I'll take a few minutes though to introduce the practice. So in essence, part of what characterizes the approach to practice that we're calling the accumulation of positive karma, the karmic accumulation, or development or transformation, any of those kind of words would be fine as well, is that it has to do particularly with those types of practices where we actively cultivate a positive energy on the form level. And on the form level, again, I mean either the mental, astral, or physical level. So for instance, a physical action, like if we do something kind for another person, that's an active, an action that we intentionally perform on the physical plane, the physical body. Whereas, for instance, if we repeat a mantra or a positive statement, or we engage in actions of visualization, or in fact, even if we move out of our physical body and function in our astral body, and engage in, say, service on the astral plane, or if we engage in a healing practice and work, say, with energy, etheric vitality, or chi. All of these are versions of what I mean by the practices that are all active, spiritual, karmic activities. Because they have the characteristic that they're related to the form level, whether it's mental and astral or physical, and that we engage in them actively. Like we could relate to those levels in a more passive or mindful or investigative way, where we're not actively trying to change the content of those bodies or that dimension of experience. We are simply observing or investigating or noticing what's going on there. So there's less of a concrete form of karma being engaged in at that point, and more of a contemplation, you might say. So this other form of practice is particularly an active type, when we generate karma. And we can do that in a lot of different ways, and we can do it in our physical bodies, and we can do it in our subtle bodies, and we can do it with etheric energy. So I'm going to use a practice that I've shared before. It's one that I learned from Daskalos' teachings. So some of you, either through me or through his teachings in other ways, may know this practice, but we're going to use it in this context. One, because I think it's a very powerful practice, what I encourage people to use if they feel so inclined. But also because it's a very good example of a multifaceted approach to creating very positive energy and karma in relationship to our own personalities. So let's get comfortable and close our eyes. And start by being aware of your breath and your physical body as a whole. And as you breathe, feel your body relaxing. letting go of thoughts and other concerns and just becoming more present to your body. And now turn your attention to your sensing your toes and your feet. Just calmly try to be as aware of the sensations in that part of your body as you can. And now move your awareness up into your lower legs, sensing your lower legs as clearly as you can. So you're aware now of your feet and your lower legs. And expanding your awareness up into your knees, and into your upper legs. Being aware now of the entirety of both legs and your feet. And now visualize white light surrounding your legs and feet and extending beyond your body several inches. Feel this light gently energizing and calming, nurturing your legs and feet. And now moving your awareness up into your hips. And your lower abdomen. Feeling the area from about your solar plexus down to your hips. And seeing that area surrounded by white light and permeated suffusing your whole body. This enhances the etheric vitality in your body, promoting health and healing. And now moving your awareness into the region of your solar plexus. And visualizing there a sphere of blue-white light. Well, about a meter in diameter. So extending out beyond your body, but permeating the region of it and centered in your solar plexus, just below the rib cage. This helps to build up an even stronger storehouse of etheric vitality for your body's health and energy. And while visualizing this ball of light, wish good health to your physical body. Now move your awareness up into your chest and visualize a rose white colored ball of light, slightly smaller than the first one, surrounding your heart and chest. Feel this nurturing your astral body, your emotions and desires, bringing contentment and love. And while seeing this ball of light, wish peace and contentment to your emotional body. Now be aware of these two balls of light. They overlap, but in some mysterious way they remain distinct in color. At the same time, you can see and feel the white light surrounding your lower body and legs. And now move your awareness into your throat center. And visualize there a small ball of orange light. This helps to purify your energy and strengthen your thyroid gland. Extend your awareness now to down your arms and into your hands. And see your arms and hands surrounded by a field of white light, permeating your arms and hands and extending beyond it, beyond them. And now extending your awareness into your head. Visualize a sphere of golden yellow light surrounding your head. While seeing this ball of light around your head, wish for clarity and wisdom in your mental body. See now at the same time these four spheres of light. Feeling the rest of your body surrounded and suffused with white light. And wish your personality to be protected and strong and peaceful. And when you feel ready, open your eyes. This practice is a very good example of both an active practice where you engage in the capacity to actively form energy patterns with our consciousness that have positive karmic effects on our personality. It's both an active form of exercise or meditation, but it's also very form integrated. We're engaged in sensing our body and ultimately our subtler bodies. And we're working with etheric energy through visualization and sensation. So it's very engaged at the form level, and it's a very active form of meditation. And so it's a very nice complement to types of practice that are more quiet and contemplative. I'm going to pause for a moment now to see if people have any questions about that type of meditation or that specific experience or meditation. Okay, good. Sometimes I like to refer to that type of meditation as part of a class or a type of practice as a causal practice because it works with the principle of a positive action, a cause. In some traditions, in some of the Hindu traditions, and some of the theosophical teachings, as well as a variety of other contexts that Sikhs also and others use the term causal body sometimes. Now, which body, which aspect of our nature which body is being referred to does vary from one tradition to another. But in certain teachings, this causal body, if you will, is often thought to be in the subtler aspects, the subtler dimensions of the mental body. So it's kind of like right on the threshold where the form level transitions. And it's very interesting that that's the case because it it points to the reality that the core of our capacity to self-consciously generate positive actions is in the subtlest of the three action bodies. So, it's interesting remembering that when we use this word body, the body kind of carries two connotations. We have senses in our bodies from which we can become aware of things, but we also have organs of activity like our voice or our hands or our feet through which we can perform actions. So all three of these bodies have as part of their nature that they can do things, they can act, and subsequently generate causes of karma, positive, medium, or negative. And so when we do a practice like this, we're doing what I sometimes call a causal practice, and we're exercising the capacity of our causal body as a soul to consciously engage in positive spiritual actions. And so mantra yoga is a causal practice, various kinds of visualizations like yantras and balls of light like we just did, or healing practices, or working with the tree of life or in a visual way, or working with mandalas. All of these kind of active visualization techniques, working with voice, whether it's chanting, ordinary speech, recitation of scriptures, repeating of mantras, saying of affirmations, all of these kinds of practices are verbal form actions. I call those are part of this whole category of causal practices. And the difference, and on down to the physical plane, activities that we perform with our physical body, all of these are in this realm of causal practices. And those are different than, say, for instance, merely being mindful. If we're primarily, say, for instance, listening to the nada, the Sanskrit word for like very subtle spiritual sounds. First of all, these sounds are relatively formless. They come from higher planes beyond even the astral and mental planes. These are very fine vibrations that one can hear. Many people hear them already, or one can learn how to hear them. This kind of practice is not primarily a causal practice. It affects karma. It can transform and liberate karma as part of one of its side effects. But it's more of a kind of quiet, contemplative, and more formless type of practice. So that would be an example of something that doesn't quite fit into this category of causal or karmic or active practices. But the practice that we just did was a very good example of that. In fact, it's a multifaceted one because we use the active ability to direct our attention and feel different parts of our bodies. And there's a subtle way in which we're using feeling to kind of infuse our body and emotions and even mind with more peace, more stillness, and other positive qualities. Then especially we use visualization, and it points words to affirm and express positive energies. When we do that, we're forming something that has been called, it's been referred to in different ways in different traditions, and it's very often just called a thought form in the West, in English. In some of the Eastern traditions, words like vasanas or samskaras or sankharas in Buddhism. Daskalos adopted a word from kind of medieval alchemy and esotericism and used it, interestingly, to define the same idea. He called these thought forms elementals. And it's interesting why he decided to do that. one of the reasons is that when we do something like a visualization like we just did, we're using our consciousness and our intentionality and our creative imagination to wield substance. We're actually making something happen in the energy and forms of the spiritual and energetic environments in which we live. And this form that we're building, say for instance, when we visualize a ball of light, an actual energetic sphere of light is being formed, and how powerful that form is, what it exactly looks like a clairvoyant watching a person doing this meditation could see these forms developing as they visualize them. And how bright they would be, how clear they would be dependent on the skill of the meditator. But even if the person was not very skilled at all, even just thinking about it and trying to do it does cause an energy pattern to develop, and it has a positive effect. And one of the reasons that they're called elementals is that the energies that are used to build these forms come from the elements. We use fire and air and earth and water, and even the mind elements as well. 3 mind elements. When we create one of these thought forms, these elementals. In some of the medieval spiritual teachings of different people, like Paracelsus or Swedenborg, or there is another version of the word elemental used, and it generally means a nature spirit. And the reason that both of in a sense, when we create an elemental like this in a positive way, we're creating our own kind of nature spirit. Because not only are these energy patterns that we're building made up of the energy of these elements like earth and water and air, but also they are imbued with our intelligence, our intention, our consciousness. So if we create a ball of light around ourselves, for instance, or we send it to another person with the intention that it facilitate healing, for instance, then that is part of it. We are actually imbuing a kind of spirit, an intention, and an intelligence into this energy pattern that we've built. And then it has a life of its own. It becomes kind of a creature that we've created that is linked to us because we caused it, we generated it. So karmically, we're now responsible for that elemental, that energy pattern. And it tries to go about and accomplish what we created it to do. And it could be something worldly, like we may have thought, well, I would like to get a new car, so I'm going to visualize myself driving around in a nice new car. And when we form that image, that elemental goes out into the world and tries to make that happen for us. And so, this is where the distinction between white magic and other forms of, kind of less wholesome forms of magic come into play, because what is our intention? How loving, how wholesome, how ecological, how positive is our intention, versus is it kind of sort of middle-ish? It's not necessarily a negative thought, but it's kind of more worldly or kind of personality motivated. One can do that too, so that's part of the danger of learning to master elementals, is that we want to be as wise and wholesome in our understanding and motivation as we create them. But obviously a meditation like we just did is a very positive, very nurturing, it has a very, it helps to build our vitality, it calms our personality, it brings out positive qualities in our personality, it creates a protective energy field so that negative energy sort of floating around in our environment or even directed at us has less of an ability to penetrate that. But it doesn't, one thing that people need to understand is sometimes people feel that, well, if you create light around yourself, aren't you sort of blocking out the world? That would only be the case if that's your intention. If you, so part of building an elemental is the understanding and intention you build into it, because your thoughts about what this is about are part of the elemental. It not only has a kind of energetic Shakti aspect of vibration and energy and shape and vitality, but it also has intelligence and intention built into it as far as what your intention was. So if you visualize yourself surrounded by a sphere of light and your thought is, I don't like the world, I don't trust people, and I don't want any energy coming through this at all, then that's the intention you've created. But if you say, well, I want to be a compassionate person, I want to be able to sense other people's emotions if I intend to, but I don't want negative energy that I haven't intentionally let in to just be randomly absorbed or be directed at me and impinge on my energy. So I choose to create an energy field that screens out energy that comes at me with negative intention, that I'm filtering out. So see, it really depends on what your intention is. And so it's an important part of the creation of positive karma and this type of positive karma, which is creation of what we could call elementals or energy patterns or thought forms. We want to be very mindful of what exactly is our understanding of what we're doing and what intention we have. And it's pretty simple. We just simply want our motivations to be positive, and we want to have some basic understanding of spiritual principles so that we can create wholesome, positive elementals. Our whole personality is made up of these elementals, the sum total of what we call our personality. All our capacities, if we've learned to play an instrument, this is a pattern of elementals that we've developed, that we've spent hundreds or thousands of hours creating elementals that allow our bodies to play an instrument, or things that we've learned, mental capacities, the knowledge that we have in our minds, our memories, our desires, our emotions. All of these are elementals. Our entire personality is the sum total of all of the elementals that we've ever created, not only in this life, but in other lives. And in fact, when we reincarnate, a collection of elementals that we've generated in past lives are selected to be expressed in this incarnation as the ongoing experience of our working with our karma and being a human being. And so a lot of our character in our current incarnation was actually formed in previous lives and is carried over in the form of these elementals or psychological energy patterns. So part of what we're doing on the spiritual path is kind of waking up, realizing that this is what's going on, and then consciously taking responsibility for that, saying, okay, what I'm currently experiencing is the product of how I've done this in the past. And one of the important things to understand about the formation of elementals is that they can be formed consciously, like we did in the exercise a little while ago, or they can be formed unconsciously, which is what happens most of the time. In other words, when we are in a conversation and someone says something that we really enjoy and we have a positive reaction, we're forming an elemental about what the person just said, but we don't necessarily think of it in those ways, and we don't do it intentionally. It just instinctually takes place. So human beings have this power to form elementals, but most of the time we use it in an unconscious, instinctual way, and it just happens constantly. So part of what we're doing on a spiritual path is taking charge of this process the formation of elementals that's constantly going on. And trying to do it more skillfully, being more mindful, more wise, and more wholesome in our motivations for doing that. So an exercise like we just did is also an exercise in remembering, oh, I have this power, and I'm going to exercise it. I'm going to be mindful that I can do this. And so you can be standing at line and waiting at the checkout counter, and the person that's checking people out is getting frustrated by the person in front of you who's being annoying, and then you might just decide, well, here I am in this situation. I'm just going to create a ball of light or an egg-shaped field of light around this person at the checkout counter, and wish good health and calmness to their emotional body, and maybe throw a field of light around the person that's annoying them also, and just bringing out their soul more, just not trying to control them. You're just sort of wishing. It's a blessing. It's a wish for their good health and positive state of mind. All the time we have opportunities to do this. I think it was the 16th Karmapa, Tibetan Buddhist master, who there's a story that he was brought into the United States one time. He was brought to an aquarium, and he was walking around this large, aquarium structure where all the different forms of aquatic life were swimming, and he kept going over and tapping the glass, and he appeared to be trying to get their attention. And one of his students asked him what he was doing, and he said, well, I'm getting their attention so I can bless them. He was just going around blessing all the fish in the aquarium. There's infinite opportunity to use elementals to promote healing, to transform karma, to serve other people, to bless ourselves, to bless the whole planet. There's no limit to it's essentially a formation of positive energy patterns of that sort is key to the experience of consciously incarnating in the form dimensions, because it's through these patterns that we manifest in the form dimensions. Like our soul thinks of our personality as a conscious creation that it's co-creating all the time by generating elementals. And so we both come into this world in part through creating elementals, and we participate in the world in part by creating elementals. It's fundamental to our entire experience of being incarnate beings in the universe. And so in a sense, there's a question, how does creation of elementals combine with just accepting everything as it is in any given moment? This is actually a fascinating topic, because there are one way to look at this is there's two sort of fundamentally, and at times almost apparently contradictory qualities that we may cultivate on the spiritual path. One can be characterized as a whole dimension of experience that is essentially more passive. It's an accepting quality. It's equanimity. It's a kind of being with things as they are. Sometimes people will even describe it as like living in the moment, or Krishnamurti sometimes called this attitude choiceless awareness. I think we're probably all familiar with that aspect of spiritual teachings, and some teachings and teachers kind of emphasize that aspect of things, sort of making it sound like active creation is always a product of dualism or ego or some kind of misguided understanding. So you really want to just be with things as they are, live in the moment, or there's a Taoist term, wu wei, which means like non-action, sort of flowing with reality in a non-active way, where you sort of somehow exist. And then there's an entirely opposite teaching that's part of probably most spiritual traditions, in my experience, that has to do with acknowledging intention, acknowledging choice, acknowledging the creative capacity of a human being to generate positive karma, for instance. So there's a mysterious question that arises, how do we integrate these two? Or should they be integrated? Is one of them more true, more valid than the other? Well, in spirit of a kind of balanced and integrative approach that I'm sure you're all aware of is my leaning, I'm sure you can also guess that I see this as complementary principles, and that both are part of a more complete approach to the spiritual path. As we develop intuition more and more, one of the basic effects of intuition is that intuition is a state of consciousness that's not puzzled by apparent contradictions. It's the intellect primarily that would say, accepting reality as it is and proactively participating in positive actions as seemingly contradictory. And they do seem to the intellect to be contradictory. To intuition, they are not contradictory. Intuition can see how these two realities are profoundly interdependent and can be married in a way in which they not only don't contradict each other, they can be seen as key to a full experience of their opposite. One way of understanding that is that if we understand acceptance as a quality of awareness that we can bring to our human nature, but we also notice that part of our human nature is our body, and our body's nature is to do things. It's just what bodies do. They're active, they're Shakti, they're part of life, they're part of a flow of activity and energy and phenomena. Then in a very interesting way, then if we deeply accept our complete nature, in my experience, that means accepting our body aspect, our Shakti, and its tendency to create and to do things, and to not try to obstruct that, to accept that that's its natural way. And as that part, our body, Shakti, active nature becomes more enlightened, it naturally just becomes wiser and more loving in why it does what it does, but it never stops doing that. It never stops acting. So even some of the most advanced masters that we have awareness of in the world, and of course people's opinions vary what's an advanced master, but to me there are lots of examples from all traditions of very advanced spiritual beings, and in most cases, not all, but in most cases, many of them have led not only active lives, but in some instances extremely active lives. But they bring a profound quality of peace and contentment and equanimity and acceptance to that at the same time. And in some way that's sort of paradoxical or even contradictory to the intellect. It seems like those two shouldn't go along. But my understanding of the enlightened state is that they're not only compatible, they're really just two sides of a total understanding of what enlightenment means. It's both Shiva and Shakti, both an equanimous, spacious, accepting awareness and an engaged, active, participating energy. Well, there's lots more to say about elementals, but I will shift now more, since we're kind of in the question and answer mode, we'll just stay with that now. Do you mean that thought forms and elementals are one and the same? Well, it kind of depends on how we define thought. Thought form the way I use these terms, and I think the way most people do, the way a thought form is described or defined in an elemental, in the context that I'm using it, which is inspired by Daskalos' use of the term. Thought form and elemental mean the same thing. Not all thought, though, in the deepest definition of the word, creates an elemental in the way we're talking about, because some thought takes place on formless levels. We could define thought on the mental plane as thought with form. In other words, thought on the mental plane takes place is mediated through elementals or thought forms. Thought on the intuitive plane, if it's sort of, let's say, if the mind, the intellect, is quiet and formless understanding is happening. Let's say, for instance, this is a common example I like to use. If you were to attune, let's say here and now, as listening to me talking, if you pay attention to the reality that you're conscious of what I'm saying, and you're conscious of the fact that you're conscious, that thought, if you want to call it a thought, because it is a type of cognition, it's a type of knowing, isn't necessarily generating an elemental. If you say to yourself, I'm aware that I'm aware, now you've created an elemental because you've given it a verbal form, and that's an elemental. But if you simply have the pure, formless, intuitive knowingness that you're conscious right now, that's not taking place mediated through elementals. It's just a pure knowing. So that's one way to understand the distinction between certain levels of formless knowing can take place without elementals and do take place without elementals. A thought form comes into being when we give form to that understanding. Like if I say, I can have the formless knowingness of goodwill towards my personality. But if I form a visual image, say, of a ball of light around my personality with the intention that that concretely nurture my personality, now I've created an elemental. So yes, there's a distinction between the two, and what deep meditation gives us access to is the ability to enter more formless states where we can contemplate truths even beyond elementals, because elementals are powerful and important, an inevitable part of our path. We need to become competent at creating positive elementals, because we're already creating them anyway. As human incarnate personalities, we're constantly creating elementals. So it's just part of spiritual awakening to notice that that's happening and learn how to do that more consciously, and to make choices about when to do it and when not to. Because it's, at times we may be in a state of soulful presence and knowingness and not choose to engage in creating any elementals. There's no necessity to, per se. It's really a choice in any given moment. Do I want to enter actively into the realm of form and engage my bodies and do something actively through elementals and physical activity? Or do I want, on any of those three levels or on all of them at the same time? Or do I want to remain more attuned to a kind of formless, soulful state of presence in which a knowingness can be present, but without, in that moment, forming an elemental to go along with that? Is that making sense to folks? Yeah. Any other questions? Let's see, I think we're muted, so in case people would like to ask out loud.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
This is Tamara. I'm on the phone.
Oh, yes.
So I'm curious. I do a lot of Buddhist practice where you basically are receiving love from a benefactor, like a Buddha, Tara, something like that, and then you're then receiving it deeply, so that it sort of upholds your basic goodness and helps develop it. And then you would wish that for others. So this is something that I've been doing a lot of over the last few years. Is this essentially developing elementals, or is it not? I mean, it's not a very visual. It's more somatic. I'm actually connecting with the felt sense of radiating their being, but not. It's more somatic than it is visual.
It can. The essence of a practice like that is more formless, but if especially if you enter into any kind of active visualization, or even just passive visualization where the experience that you're cultivating happens to generate imagery, whether active or just spontaneously, or if there's verbal, like you said, for instance, that there's an aspect of blessing where you then share that with other people. If that sometimes in Buddhist practices that can take a verbal form. But if it doesn't, if all of it remains more essential, more formless, then it's kind of minimizing the amount that it's generating elementals. That in that context, it's not. Whereas, let's say at the Buddhist practice of metta or loving kindness, that's very much a practice of generating elementals, because there's a standard system of verbal statements that are used to express that spirit. So it's in both cases, whether an elemental is formed or not, there's always a soulful or more essential aspect of it, such as you described, Tamara. But also you can add the form aspect to it through different means. And it's not just necessarily verbal and or visual. You can also give it form. You can create elementals in a more felt way too, because touch is a concrete bodily sense also. So there's a way in which, but normally the way we kind of give touch expression is through movement. And so that's
through what again?
It's through physical movement.
Okay.
So if you're not physically moving and you're just kind of feeling energies flowing and it has a kind of feeling sensation to it, then there's much less of a dimension of elementals being involved in it. Kind of a more soulful and intuitive type of practice.
But there's also, I guide these meditations, and the words used to guide it are wishing them love, wishing them deepest well-being, that kind of thing. So you're making statements, especially if you're guiding it, rather than just sort of doing it internally. You're using words. In that case, would you say that elementals are being built?
Well, certainly, let's say at the moment when if you're guiding it and you're using statements, you're building elementals then. And then also if the person, either because you guide them to, or they just choose to themselves, when you encourage them to express, say, a blessing, if they choose to put that into a verbal form, then in that moment they're creating an elemental also.
Okay, all right. That's clarifying. I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome. And incidentally, these elementals have a life after that. I want to reiterate, because it's useful to know and remember that elementals then continue to have this power. Let's say, for instance, if we say, I wish peace and well-being to the earth or to humanity. Now I've created an elemental, and that moment of blessing isn't over now, because that elemental has a certain charge to it that's dependent on how much consciousness and energy I put into that elemental when I formed it. And it'll have that vitality and that vibration to it, and it will continue to fulfill that intention as long as that energy lasts for. And if if the energy is very strong, if a person is very advanced, it can last for years, decades, even centuries. In fact, a lot of the elementals we form have been around for multiple lives. But the reason that many of those elementals persist is because we didn't necessarily give them a great deal of energy when they were first formed. So they use up that energy, and then they come back and they enter into our subconscious, and then they come back into our conscious awareness seeking to get re-energized. So that if we suddenly have a familiar thought that we've had many times before, and now this time that we have it, we kind of think to ourselves, yes, I do love chocolate cake. That elemental that's been around for years, if not centuries, is now getting re-energized every time we reaffirm it to ourselves. And it's only at the point where when it re-arises, if we just feel it and be aware of it with equanimity, then we're not re-energizing it. And then the energy of that elemental starts to fade, and it'll keep trying to kind of get our attention so we can feed it. It's like a child that we've created, this little life form, and it wants to get re-energized. And if we don't, it doesn't hurt it in any way, but it does kind of allow the energy to fade, and then eventually that elemental will become quiescent. It's like it will kind of float to, if we think of our subconscious as a big pool of energy, those elementals will kind of just quietly go to the bottom and go to rest there. And if we never re-energize them again, they're eternally there in the subconscious, but they have no energy or vitality anymore. So that karma is done. It's completed. If the energy has been discharged and we don't re-energize it, then the karma of that elemental is complete. Let's see. Okay, there. I'm going to turn. There's a question.
Yes, that is me.
Yes.
Well, I have a question concerning what you mentioned in the first half about if you have some kind of heaviness in your life, in your physical life.
What was the word? Some kind of
heaviness.
Heaviness, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
And you said that could come from you working out a negative karma through that experience, through having a heaviness in your physical body. So that caught my interest because I have a heaviness in my physical body with daily pains in the body, and so I was wondering how do you work with it? Did you mention that, or maybe I didn't quite catch it? How do you work with that? Is something about you can work with the karma to get the question?
Generally, incidentally, any heaviness that we feel in our bodies is generally caused by elementals that we've created in this or other life that have, and remember we're calling them elementals because they're made out of the elements. And one of the ways that comes into play right now that can help us understand the nature of an elemental is one of the ways that elementals differ is the proportion of different elements in that thought form, in that energy pattern, that elemental. So if the watery, earthy elements are stronger, those energies will kind of feel thicker in our personalities. They will flow through our energy body. These elementals flow through our system, through our chakras and our energy body. And if they're heavier elementals, they'll make us feel more tired and kind of thicker and obstructed. And all of us have these. Everybody has heavier elementals and medium elementals and very finer, more, as the Hindus say, sattvic, which means a kind of more harmonious, more refined elementals. It sounds like maybe I'll just turn the mics off. Okay. There's various ways for these elementals to be transformed or purified, you might say. One of them is if we experience them, as I was saying earlier, with equanimity. So that's like a few key qualities we can bring to bear on an elemental. If we're aware of it, say, so for instance, if we're just feeling heaviness in our bodies, tiredness even, that's the first step, is just being aware of it. If we're also accepting and equanimous towards it, then we're not re-energizing it, because if we, let's say if it's an elemental like a desire for a certain kind of food, like my example earlier for chocolate cake, if we re-energize it and say, yes, I like this, then that elemental persists because we've given it more energy. But also reacting against an elemental creates more elementals and kind of feeds it in a backdoor kind of way. So if we have energies that are unpleasant and we react with aversion to them, then they tend to persist too, because A, we're not providing optimal conditions to be purified, and secondly, we're creating new elementals that are averse to the other elementals. I guess I haven't turned. There we go. Have to learn to multitask. So a basic method is to just practice, whether it's in meditation or day-to-day life. If we practice being open to whatever we're experiencing, whether it's emotional pain or heaviness in our body or restlessness or boredom or unpleasant physical sensations, like we may feel nausea, or all the different kinds of things, physical, emotional, or even mental, that we can, if we bring a spirit of awareness and equanimity and acceptance to what we're experiencing, then it will both accelerate the rate at which those energies are worked off, and the acceptance doesn't re-energize them, so they don't persist anymore. And the awareness that we're bringing to it kind of helps to, it's kind of like the bigger our awareness, the more elementals can move through that and be purified in any given moment. So the stronger our awareness and the stronger our acceptance, the faster these energies will pass through and be purified. So if it's heaviness, for instance, we just have to persist in letting those energies be there and accepting that they're there. And through that kind of practice, they'll eventually pass, and we won't feel that anymore. So that's one method. Another method is to actively create positive elementals, because those will interact with heavier elementals, for instance, and speed up them being worked off also. So any positive kind of spiritual practice, like the one we did earlier with the visualizations and so on, that will also accelerate working through heavier energy. And breathing practices, walking meditation, essentially any kind of spiritual practice will accelerate working through this kind of karma. And then it just depends on what works best for the individual, what's more accessible, more natural for that person. So people can experiment and see what works best for them. So let me unmute and see if we have a follow-up to that. Is it Johnny?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the answer. I have a follow-up.
Okay.
Because I've been thinking uh, maybe the Kundalini could also have that effect on the body. How do you distinguish the karma effect?
Do you mean that could the Kundalini cause the tiredness or cause the purification?
Yeah, the tiredness. Yeah, and the tiredness and the pains, especially in my back and head, could also Kundalini, I think.
Yeah, the way that the Kundalini can contribute to a period of tiredness like that is because when the Kundalini awakens, it starts to move through our energy system. And in order to kind of progress in its movement, any obstruction, any elementals that are there need to kind of be brought to the surface and transformed and purified. And so sometimes a person's energy might feel fine ordinarily, then their Kundalini awakens and they suddenly go through a period of time where they feel heavier. It's not that that karma wasn't already there, it's just that the Kundalini is pushing it to the surface so that to accelerate working it off. But the net effect too will not only be to push it to the surface, but the fiery, transformative and purifying quality of the Kundalini will also liberate that energy. So it's something that still needs to be endured. We have to still deal with that energy, but the fact that the Kundalini is active means that it's being worked off in an accelerated fashion. So incidentally, that's a good example of the sort of two basic ways of looking at a spiritual process. An example of working on it more from a Shakti, energetic Kundalini side would be that example of how the Kundalini can be harnessed to bring about purification and transformation. And then just before that, I gave the example of how you could do it with awareness and cultivate qualities like equanimity and mindfulness and concentration and acceptance, and those will purify the elementals too. In reality, those two are the same. The Kundalini is the energetic sensation of growing awareness and acceptance and love and equanimity in our bodies. And so when we experience those qualities awakening in our bodies, it feels like energy. That's that. Or if we look at it more from the consciousness angle, it feels more like it's awareness and perspective and spaciousness and insight and equanimity and qualities like that. They're really just two sides of the same reality. And we experience them as either Kundalini or energy or visualizations and feelings and movements and Shakti, or as something happening more on the consciousness side. We experience the split because of our stage of development. But as we become more intuitively developed, we start to experience that these are the two sides of the same reality. They're not actually different. And yes, we can work with them from two different angles or combine them, but they're ultimately always were the same reality of awakening, whether experienced energetically or experienced from the consciousness point of view or experience. Okay, unless there is another follow-up to that, I think.
No, that was. No, thank you very much.
Good. Okay, well, I think this is a good place to stop for now. Thank you all for coming today. And
thank you.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.